My name is Riley, 26 years old, and the night I lost my data entry job, my father tossed a garbage bag at my feet and told me I had 2 hours to pack my entire life. My mother crossed her arms and said it was time I stopped holding my sister back. My sister yelled from the top of the stairs, demanding to know who would pay her car lease now. I did not shed a single tear. I just zipped my suitcase, keeping my mouth shut, about the multi-million-dollar software company in my name and the oceanfront beach house I had just purchased. 5 hours later, they would realize they had evicted their only lifeline. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from below. Subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy thud of a black trash bag hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly through my childhood bedroom. I stood frozen in the doorway, my winter coat still damp from the freezing rain, staring at the plastic heap of my belongings. Richard, my 58-year-old father, did not even look up as he yanked my sweaters off their hangers, crumpling them before shoving them into a second bag. "You have exactly 2 hours to get the rest of this junk out of my house," he announced, his voice carrying the cold tone he used to belittle subordinates at his mid-level management job. I stepped fully into the room, my hands trembling slightly. It was not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of the day I had just endured. "Dad, I just got laid off," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "They terminated my data entry position this morning without warning." My mother, Patricia, a 55-year-old woman who thrived on family drama, appeared in the hallway behind me. Instead of offering a comforting hug, she let out a loud theatrical sigh and dramatically rolled her eyes. "I knew it," Patricia scoffed, pushing past me to grab a stack of my paperback books. "You can never hold down a real job, Riley. Stop crying and start packing right now." I was not crying. My eyes were completely dry. I watched Richard forcefully zip the heavy trash bag, his face turning an angry shade of red. "We are done letting you leech off us," he barked, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. "Your sister needs this room immediately. Leeching off you." I repeated the word, tasting bitter on my tongue. "I pay you $1,500 every single month. That is 70% of what my data entry job actually paid. I buy the groceries for this household. I pay the utility bills so you can keep the heat cranked up all winter. Meanwhile, Vanessa and Jamal have been living in the master suite for 2 solid years without paying a single dime." "Do not you dare bring Jamal into this conversation," Patricia snapped, snatching a framed photo from my nightstand and tossing it into a cardboard box. "Jamal is an entrepreneur. His crypto startup is about to secure a massive $2 million seed round from serious investors. He and Vanessa are expecting their first child very soon. They need the extra space to operate their business and prepare a nursery for the baby. Winners need a supportive environment to thrive and grow. Failures need to learn how to survive out there in the real world on their own." The hypocrisy was suffocating. For years, I had quietly subsidized my parents' suburban lifestyle and my older sister's relentless luxury habits, all while pretending to be struggling financially. I played the role of the quiet, unremarkable data clerk, perfectly absorbing their constant insults to keep the peace. I wore cheap clothes from thrift stores and drove an ancient, sputtering car, all while secretly funneling my actual wealth into secure investment accounts. They looked at me and saw an easy scapegoat. They saw someone weak enough to financially exploit without any consequences. Richard checked his watch, tapping the crystal face impatiently. 1 hour and 45 minutes, Riley. If you are not out of this house by then, I am personally leaving these bags on the curb." I did not argue. I did not fall to my knees and beg for a second chance. I simply walked over to the closet, pulled out my sole travel suitcase, and began calmly placing my laptop and a few essential items inside. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with their eager anticipation of my inevitable emotional breakdown. But I offered them absolutely nothing. I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound sharp and final in the tense air. Just as I grabbed the handle and turned toward the hallway to leave, a shrill, panic-stricken voice echoed loudly from the top of the stairs. "Wait!" Vanessa shrieked, waddling quickly down the carpeted steps while awkwardly holding her pregnant belly. If she got fired from her job, who is going to pay the $800 monthly lease on my Tesla? I paused at the front door, feeling the bitter cold draft seeping through the worn weather stripping. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a maxed-out debit card, and dropped it casually onto the wooden table. "Good luck with that payment," I said, making direct eye contact with her. I stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, severing my ties to them forever. As I walked down the driveway, my phone vibrated intensely in my pocket. It was a secure text message from my corporate lawyer, David. "The transfer for the $15 million Hamptons Beach house is officially complete. Oceanfront LLC is entirely in your name, CEO." I smiled into the street, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. I was ready for the brutal storm they were about to blindly bring upon themselves. The heavy footsteps descending the wooden staircase broke the tense silence in the entryway. Vanessa waddled into view, her hand resting performatively on her swollen belly. She wore a pristine cashmere lounge set that I had actually purchased for her birthday 2 months prior. Right behind her came Jamal. He moved with the exaggerated swagger of a man desperate to prove his wealth, a stark contrast to his actual financial reality. Jamal was draped in flashy designer logos from head to toe. A thick gold chain rested over his fitted black turtleneck, and an oversized, clearly fake designer watch weighed down his left wrist. He aggressively twirled a set of car keys around his index finger, the metal clinking loudly as he stepped off the bottom stair. He did not offer a word of sympathy about my sudden job loss. Instead, Jamal marched directly into my personal space, invading the small gap between my suitcase and the front door. He looked me up and down with a sneer of absolute disgust. "Look." Little sister Jamal started, his voice booming with unearned authority. "My crypto software startup is about to close a $2 million seed round by the end of the month. Vanessa and I need your room for my new executive home office. Winners need space to operate. Failures need to learn how to survive out there in the real world." He puffed out his chest, glancing back at my father for validation. Richard nodded approvingly, looking at Jamal as if he were the son he had always wanted. It was sickening. Jamal had not held a steady job in 4 years. His so-called startup consisted of him sitting in my parents' living room, playing video games, and occasionally shouting buzzwords like blockchain and disruption into his phone. Yet in my family eyes, his delusions of grandeur made him a visionary, while my actual steady income made me a disposable workhorse. Patricia practically shoved past my suitcase, completely ignoring the fact that her youngest daughter was being thrown onto the street in the middle of a freezing storm. She carried a crystal tray holding a glass of sparkling cider and a plate of expensive imported cheeses. She offered it directly to Jamal with a fawning smile, treating him like royalty. "Drink up, Jamal," Patricia cooed, adjusting the collar of his designer jacket. "You have been working so hard on your pitch deck. You need to keep your energy up for those big investors." Vanessa grabbed a piece of cheese from the tray and turned her attention back to me, her eyes narrowing with calculated greed. She pointed a manicured finger at my purse. "If you just lost your job, you are going to be useless for the household bills," Vanessa complained, her voice dripping with venom. "But you still have your emergency credit card. Hand it over right now." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at her audacity. "You want my credit card while Dad is literally kicking me out of the house?" Vanessa crossed her arms, resting them on her pregnant belly as a prop. "Who is going to pay the $800 monthly lease on my Tesla, Riley? You promised to contribute to this family. You owe us. Consider it your duty as an aunt to provide a safe, reliable vehicle for your unborn nephew. You cannot just walk out of here and abandon your financial responsibilities to my child." The sheer delusion in her demand was staggering. She was standing in a house I paid the majority of the bills for, wearing clothes I bought, demanding I finance her luxury car, while I was supposedly unemployed and homeless. Richard stepped forward, crossing his arms to mirror his golden child. "Listen to your sister, Riley." Richard barked, his face stern. "Hand over the card. You have leeched off our goodwill for long enough. It is the absolute least you can do to repay us before you leave." I looked at the four of them. My father, who measured love in dollars. My mother, who enabled his cruelty. My sister, who believed the world owed her everything. And my brother-in-law, a con artist playing a dangerous game with my parents' retirement funds. A year ago, this level of betrayal would have broken me into a million pieces. I would have cried, begged, and emptied my bank accounts just to earn a fraction of their affection. But today I felt nothing but a chilling absolute clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply smiled. It was a cold, dead-eyed smile that made Jamal take a slight step back. "Of course, Vanessa," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You are absolutely right. I have a duty to this family." I reached into my purse and pulled out a sleek blue debit card. It was an old account, completely empty and maxed out from a previous business expense transfer I had executed weeks ago. I held it out between my index and middle fingers. Vanessa snatched it from my hand with a triumphant smirk, immediately slipping it into the pocket of her cashmere cardigan. "Good," Vanessa muttered, turning her nose up at me. "Now get out. You are ruining the energy in my house." I grabbed the handle of my solitary suitcase. I did not say goodbye. I did not look back. I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped right out into the freezing, relentless rain. The icy wind hit my face instantly, but it felt incredibly refreshing. Behind me, the front door slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud. The lock clicked into place. They had locked me out of the only home I had ever known. I stood on the wet pavement, letting the rain wash over my shoulders. I was supposed to be a victim. I was supposed to be terrified, homeless, and broken. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket as my phone vibrated with an urgent notification. I swiped the screen open. It was a secure text message from David, my lead corporate attorney. "The $15 million Hamptons Beach House transfer is completely finalized. Oceanfront, LLC, is now entirely in your name, CEO. The keys are waiting for you at the private helipad." I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked up at the glowing window of my former bedroom where I could see Jamal already pacing around, waving his arms as he planned his fake office space. They thought they had just discarded a useless data entry clerk. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a millionaire who held every single one of their financial strings in the palm of her hand. My sweet revenge was just beginning. The next morning, the freezing rain had given way to a crisp, blindingly bright Manhattan skyline. The chaotic, desperate energy of my childhood home was miles away, replaced by the hushed, expensive quiet of Wall Street. A sleek, midnight black Maybach pulled up to the curb, and my driver, Marcus, immediately stepped out to open my door. I did not emerge wearing the baggy, faded sweaters and scuffed sneakers my family was so accustomed to mocking. Instead, I stepped onto the pavement wearing a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal designer suit and crimson stiletto heels. The transformation was complete. The frightened, financially drained daughter they thought they had discarded was gone. I walked through the revolving doors of the towering glass-fronted headquarters of Apex Solutions. It was the exact same massive fintech corporation that had supposedly fired me the previous morning. As my heels clicked against the pristine Italian marble floor of the lobby, the atmosphere in the building shifted instantly. The front desk staff who yesterday had watched me carry a cardboard box out of the service elevator immediately stood up at attention. The head of security tipped his hat, pressing a button to override the VIP elevator bank. "Good morning, CEO," he said respectfully. "Good morning, Frank," I replied smoothly. There was no layoff. There was no budget cut. I was the undercover founder and CEO of Apex Solutions. For the past 6 months, I had disguised myself as a low-level data entry clerk to investigate alarming reports of workplace harassment and toxic middle management within my own company. I sat in a cramped cubicle fetching coffee and enduring insults from mid-level managers who thought they held ultimate power. The arrogant human resources director, who had smugly handed me a termination notice yesterday, had absolutely no idea she was firing the owner of the building. She would be finding her own belongings packed in a cardboard box before noon today. The entire operation had been a social experiment, a way to clean house and test the integrity of my staff from the bottom up. It had also served as the perfect test for my family, a test they had failed with spectacular cruelty. The private elevator doors opened directly into my penthouse office, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city I had conquered. David, my lead corporate attorney, was already waiting for me at my custom glass desk. He did not look like the relaxed lawyer who had texted me the night before. His expression was grim, and he held a thick manila dossier in his hands. He placed it squarely on my desk the moment I sat down. "You are going to want to see this immediately, Riley," David said, sliding the file toward me. "I had my investigative team look into your brother-in-law and his highly anticipated crypto software startup." I flipped open the heavy cover, my eyes scanning the highlighted financial records and technical blueprints inside. Jamal had bragged about securing a $2 million seed round to my father, puffing his chest out as if he were the next tech visionary. The reality printed on the pages before me was pathetic, yet highly illegal. Jamal did not have a startup. He had a poorly constructed Ponzi scheme. He had been creating fake shell companies to solicit illegal investments from gullible individuals, promising them massive returns on a blockchain integration platform that did not actually exist. But that was not even the worst part. David tapped a specific page in the dossier, drawing my attention to a string of familiar code. "He is not just running a scam," David explained, his voice low and serious. "The technical architecture he is presenting to these angel investors is stolen. He somehow managed to pirate a beta version of our proprietary software. He is using Apex Solutions' intellectual property to bait his victims. He thinks he acquired untraceable code from a dark web forum, completely unaware that he stole it directly from your company." A slow, dangerous realization washed over me. Jamal was a thief, and my father had likely funded his entire fake operation using the money I had been sending them for rent and groceries. They had kicked me out to make room for a criminal enterprise built on my own stolen life work. The poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect. Suddenly, the harsh ringing of my personal cell phone shattered the quiet of the penthouse office. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Patricia. I let it ring 3 times, letting her stew in her own anxiety, before answering with a perfectly neutral tone. "What do you want?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Riley, we have a massive emergency," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of guilt about throwing me into the street hours prior. "Jamal's luxury SUV is in the shop for sudden repairs. Vanessa needs the Tesla for her prenatal appointments, and Jamal has a critical meeting with a lead angel investor in the Hamptons this weekend. We need you to come back here and sign over the title of your old Honda to him immediately." I stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline, amazed by her complete lack of self-awareness. She wanted the car I had driven for 7 years, the very car she constantly called an embarrassing piece of junk to save her golden son-in-law. "He cannot possibly drive a rental," Patricia continued, her tone frantic. "Investors need to see that he is resourceful. Give him your car, Riley. It is sitting in the driveway anyway since you are unemployed." I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer insanity of asking a favor from the daughter they had just made homeless. I knew exactly where that Hamptons meeting would take place because my father had just booked my own beachfront estate for the weekend. "Fine," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured defeat. "I will meet you in the parking lot of the grocery store near the house tomorrow morning. I will bring the title and the keys." I hung up the phone without waiting for her reply. I looked up at David, tossing the phone onto the desk. A predatory smile formed on my face as the ultimate trap fell perfectly into place. "David," I said, leaning forward, "my family is driving my old Honda to the Hamptons this weekend to pitch my stolen software to investors. Before I hand those keys over to my mother tomorrow, I want you to take the car to our security team. Strip the interior if you have to. Install hidden dash cams in the rearview mirror and place active GPS trackers under the chassis. I want eyes and ears on every single move Jamal makes." David nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the arrangements. "Consider it done, boss." They wanted to play the roles of wealthy entrepreneurs. They wanted to cast me as the pathetic failure. But they were driving straight into a $15 million cage, and I held the only key. The gray morning sky over Queens matched the dingy asphalt of the strip mall parking lot where I had agreed to meet my mother. I stood next to my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car that had reliably gotten me through college and my grueling early days building Apex Solutions. Now it was rigged with enough state-of-the-art surveillance technology to monitor a foreign embassy. I wore a plain beige trench coat over my designer suit, playing the part of the destitute evicted daughter to absolute perfection. A heavily leased Mercedes SUV aggressively pulled into the spot next to me. Patricia stepped out carefully, avoiding a puddle to protect her expensive leather boots. She looked around the rundown parking lot with visible disgust before her harsh gaze finally landed on me. She did not ask where I had slept last night. She did not ask if I had eaten. She simply held out her hand palm up, expecting absolute obedience. "Give me the keys!" Riley, Patricia demanded, her tone dripping with impatience. "Jamal has a very tight schedule today, and you are already wasting his valuable time. He is pitching to billionaires this weekend, and it is humiliating enough that he has to show up in this absolute rusted-out trash can of a vehicle." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the worn set of keys. I let them dangle from my fingers for a split second, locking eyes with the woman who had birthed me. I wanted to see if there was even a shred of maternal guilt hiding behind her perfectly applied makeup. There was none. She snatched the keys from my hand with a sharp tug. "Listen to me very carefully," Patricia said, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Your father is furious. Your sister is stressed, which is terrible for the baby. You have been nothing but a massive disappointment to this family. Do not call us. Do not text us. Do not even think about showing up at the house again unless you have a real job and a fat check to apologize for your completely selfish behavior." I kept my expression entirely blank. "Have a safe trip, Mom," I replied softly. Patricia scoffed, sliding into the driver's seat of my Honda. She slammed the door shut and sped out of the parking lot without a single backward glance. I watched the taillights fade into the morning traffic, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The final thread tying me to their toxic world had just been cleanly severed. 20 minutes later, I was back in the secure, soundproofed environment of my penthouse office at Apex Solutions. David was already sitting at the massive conference table, 2 steaming cups of coffee waiting. He tapped the spacebar on his laptop, bringing the large monitor on the wall to life. "The tracking devices are fully online," Boss David said, adjusting his glasses. "Audio and video feeds are crystal clear. Let us see exactly what this brilliant tech entrepreneur is up to today." I sat down and focused on the screen. The hidden camera concealed within the rearview mirror provided a perfect high-definition view of the Honda's interior. Jamal was in the driver's seat, bopping his head to loud rap music, looking incredibly pleased with himself. The GPS tracker showed him driving away from his supposed co-working space in the financial district and heading deep into the industrial sector of Brooklyn. He parked the car in a sketchy alleyway behind an abandoned-looking warehouse. David and I watched the live feed as Jamal confidently walked up to a heavy steel door, knocked in a specific rhythmic pattern, and slipped inside. David quickly ran the address through our proprietary database. "That building is a known front for an illegal underground casino," David stated, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "It is entirely run by a local crime syndicate." We sat in the office for 3 solid hours while Jamal gambled away whatever money he had scrounged up. When he finally returned to the Honda, his confident swagger was entirely gone. He angrily punched the steering wheel, screaming profanities into the empty car. He had clearly lost. But his day of deceit was far from over. Jamal peeled out of the alley and drove toward a cheap run-down motel located right off the interstate. He honked the horn twice. A woman with heavy makeup and a tight red dress emerged from room number 4. She jogged over to the car and slid into the passenger seat. It was absolutely not my pregnant sister, Vanessa. "Hey, baby," the woman purred, leaning over to kiss Jamal aggressively. Jamal wrapped an arm around her, his arrogant smile returning instantly. "You ready for an amazing weekend, babe?" he asked smoothly. "I am taking you out to the Hamptons. We are going to live like absolute royalty." The woman laughed, tracing a finger down his jawline. "I thought you said you had to work. What about your annoying wife and her family?" The audio feed picked up every single devastating word with perfect clarity. "Forget about them," Jamal scoffed, rolling his eyes. "They are totally clueless. My stupid father-in-law just pulled a $200,000 home equity loan against his house to fund my fake startup. The old idiot actually thinks I am building a software empire. We are going to bleed that old man completely dry, take the cash, and disappear before he even realizes the money is gone." In my office, the air turned to ice. My blood ran completely cold. Richard had leveraged the house. He had taken a massive loan against the very same childhood home he had violently kicked me out of just 24 hours ago. He handed his entire life savings, his shelter, and his financial future over to a con artist who is currently using my car to pick up his mistress. My parents had sacrificed their loyal daughter for a glamorous illusion that was going to leave them entirely destitute. David looked at me, utterly speechless. "Riley," he whispered, "your father just bankrupted himself." Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of their stupidity, a sharp ping echoed through the quiet office. A high-priority automated email notification popped up on my secondary monitor. It was an alert from my exclusive luxury real estate management firm, the agency I used to handle the $15 million Hamptons estate I had just acquired. I clicked the notification open. New booking alert for oceanfront Hamptons estate. Renter name Richard. Rental fee $25,000. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, as the puzzle pieces slammed together. Richard was not just funding Jamal's fake startup. He was renting a luxury mansion to impress Jamal's fake billionaire investors. And out of all the properties available in New York, my father had unknowingly booked my very own beach house for this disastrous, fraudulent pitch party. I leaned back in my leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. They were walking blindly into my territory. The stage was perfectly set. Let them come. David sat across from me, his eyes wide as he processed the rental notification flashing on my secondary monitor. "Riley," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern. "You need to cancel this booking immediately. If your father brings Jamal and a bunch of fake tech investors to your property, they will completely trash the place. It is a brand new $15 million custom estate. Let me revoke the reservation right now and block their security access at the main gate." I shook my head slowly, my eyes locked on the bold text of my father's name on the screen. "Do not cancel a single thing," I instructed, leaning forward and tapping the glass of the monitor. "Approve the booking right now. But I want you to go deeply into the rental contract and trigger the strict liability clause." David frowned, his fingers hovering hesitantly over his keyboard. "You understand what that means, right? The strict liability clause means any property damage, no matter how minor, entirely bypasses the standard security deposit. It will be immediately and automatically charged directly to his linked collateral accounts. He will not even have a chance to dispute it with the bank." I smiled, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep in my chest. "Exactly," I replied. "Let him rent it. Let Jamal treat my pristine house like a frat party playground. If my father wants to blindly finance a con artist and leverage his own home to do it, he is going to pay the absolute full price for his stupidity. Approve it, David. Let the trap snap shut." By Thursday afternoon, the grand illusion my family was desperately trying to project had reached a fever pitch. I sat at my desk sipping a sparkling water, watching Vanessa broadcast a live stream on her public Instagram account. She was standing on the curb outside an exclusive luxury car dealership, wearing an absurdly tight designer maternity dress. Behind her sat a gleaming midnight blue Maybach. "We just picked up this absolute beauty for the weekend," Vanessa squealed into her phone camera, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Jamal is closing a massive $2 million seed round for his software company, so we are heading to the Hamptons for an exclusive invite-only investor retreat. We only accept the absolute best for our brand." I watched the stream with a mixture of profound disgust and dark amusement. The Maybach was obviously not a purchase. It was a weekend rental, and my financial monitoring tools showed the massive charge had hit my father's heavily leveraged home equity loan just hours ago. Richard was literally bleeding his own retirement dry to fund my sister's social media aesthetics and my brother-in-law's criminal vanity. Jamal stepped into the frame of the video, tossing a custom leather duffel bag into the trunk. He wrapped an arm around Vanessa, flashing a smug, arrogant grin at the camera. "Big moves happening this weekend," Jamal bragged, pointing directly at the lens. "Watch this space. We are taking over the entire industry." I closed the laptop screen with a sharp snap. It was time to pay my family a little visit before their grand departure. Through the active GPS tracker we had seamlessly installed in my old Honda, I knew exactly where Patricia and Vanessa were spending their afternoon. They had parked my beat-up Honda a full block away from La Maison, one of the most ridiculously overpriced high-end catering bakeries in downtown Manhattan. They were clearly too embarrassed to pull up to the valet in my old car, so they hid it in an alleyway. I threw a plain, unremarkable gray trench coat over my tailored suit, tying the belt tightly to hide the expensive fabric underneath, and headed out. When I walked into the bakery, the rich scent of fresh truffles and spun sugar filled the air. Patricia and Vanessa were standing at the main marble counter, acting as if they owned the entire city block. Vanessa was aggressively pointing at a display of miniature caviar tarts. "I want 3 dozen of those and 4 trays of the gold leaf macarons," Vanessa ordered, her voice obnoxiously loud. "Our Hamptons guests expect nothing but pure luxury." Patricia nodded in firm agreement, handing the exhausted clerk a platinum credit card. "Make sure the delivery driver arrives at the estate exactly at noon tomorrow," Patricia demanded. "It is a $5,000 order. I expect absolute perfection or I will have your manager fired." I stepped up to the counter right next to them, keeping my posture entirely relaxed and my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. "I will just take a medium black coffee, please," I said to the cashier. Patricia whipped her head around at the sound of my voice. The smug satisfaction on her face instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly sneer. She physically pulled Vanessa a step back, treating me like I was carrying a highly contagious disease. "What are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. "Are you following us? I told you not to show your face to us ever again unless you had a job and money." I kept my expression perfectly mild, simply waiting for my coffee. "I just wanted a warm drink, Mom." Vanessa rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might lose her balance. Oh my God, she probably cannot even afford a single pastry. She's just here to soak up the free air conditioning and beg for scraps. Patricia turned abruptly back to the cashier who was standing awkwardly holding my paper cup. "Keep a very close eye on her," Patricia announced, her voice echoing harshly off the marble walls of the bakery so every single customer and staff member could hear. "She was recently fired, and she is currently unemployed. She is desperate, and she might try to steal something from your display cases." The cashier blinked, clearly deeply uncomfortable with the public shaming. I did not flush. I did not look down in shame. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a solid metal exclusive black card. I tapped it against the payment reader before Patricia or Vanessa could clearly register the heavy, unmissable weight of billionaire status in my hand. The machine beeped in instant, unquestioning approval. I slipped the card back into my pocket in one fluid motion, took my $5 coffee from the counter, and turned to face my mother. I stepped just inches from her face, invading her personal space, the exact same way Jamal had done to me the night I was evicted. I leaned in close, letting a freezing, calculated smile touch my lips. "I hope the Hamptons weather is kind to you this weekend." I whispered, my voice incredibly low, barely carrying over the background noise of the busy bakery. "Enjoy the beach house." I pulled back, turned on my heel, and walked calmly out the heavy glass doors into the bustling city street. Behind me, Patricia froze completely solid. Her jaw dropped slightly, her eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror as her mind raced desperately, trying to figure out how the unemployed failure of a daughter knew about their highly classified secret weekend trip. The late Friday afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the private shoreline of East Hampton. My newly acquired $15 million estate sat perfectly positioned on a pristine stretch of beach, its massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflecting the crashing ocean waves. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring stark white lines, imported Italian marble, and an infinity pool that seemed to bleed directly into the Atlantic. The rented midnight blue Maybach crunched loudly against the gravel of the long, sweeping circular driveway. Jamal stepped out of the driver's seat first, stretching his arms wide and inhaling the salty air as if he had personally conquered the entire coastline. He wore a ridiculously flashy linen suit that screamed trying too hard, complete with a silk pocket square and loafers without socks. Vanessa emerged next, struggling slightly in her tight maternity wear, immediately lifting her phone to capture a panoramic video for her eager social media followers. Patricia and Richard trailed behind them, looking utterly out of place. Standing at absolute attention by the massive oak double front doors was David. He had swapped his custom-tailored courtroom suits for a crisp white polo shirt, khaki slacks, and a discreet earpiece. He looked exactly like a high-end property manager, ready to cater to the whims of the ultra-wealthy. I was watching the entire scene unfold live from the encrypted security feed on my laptop, sipping a glass of iced tea from the comfort of my favorite armchair back in the city. David offered a polite, practiced smile as the family approached the entrance. "Welcome to the oceanfront estate," he said smoothly. "I am David, the head property manager. I will be handling your concierge needs for the weekend." Jamal did not even bother to look David in the eye. He waved his hand dismissively, pointing a finger toward the trunk of the Maybach. "Grab the Louis Vuitton bags from the back," Jamal barked, his voice dripping with unearned superiority. "And do not scuff the leather. They cost more than you probably make in a month. Also, I need the temperature in the master suite lowered to exactly 68 degrees, and I want a bottle of vintage champagne, chilled on ice, immediately. Move it." David gave a crisp nod, showing absolutely no reaction to the blatant disrespect. "Right away," Sir David replied, moving toward the vehicle to fetch their luggage. Inside the house, the sheer scale of the luxury was staggering. The living room boasted 30-foot ceilings, a massive floating fireplace, and unobstructed views of the water. But while Vanessa immediately began posing on the white velvet sofas for photographs, my father was not relaxing. Richard was pacing the length of the marble floor, his face flushed, and a thin layer of sweat forming on his forehead. He aggressively rubbed the back of his neck, clearly doing mental math that was tearing him apart from the inside out. Jamal Richard started, his voice wavering with a heavy dose of panic. "This place is unbelievable, but $25,000 for a single weekend is an astronomical expense. I pulled every last cent of equity out of the family home to cover the wire transfer for this rental, the cars, and the catering. If this pitch does not go exactly according to plan, your mother-in-law and I are going to be completely ruined. We will lose the house." Jamal sauntered over to the sleek kitchen island, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. He leaned back, flashing a bright, arrogant smile. He was the picture of a slick, predatory salesman closing in on his final mark. "Dad, you need to stop sweating the small stuff," Jamal said, his tone patronizingly smooth. "You have to spend money to make money. This $25,000 rental is not an expense. It is a strategic investment. You are looking at the short term, but winners look at the long game." Jamal walked over and placed a heavy hand on my father's trembling shoulder, looking him dead in the eye. "Tomorrow afternoon, the lead investor is walking through those doors. Mr. Cole is a titan in the venture capital world. When he sees this house, when he sees the Maybach, when he sees the lifestyle we project, he is going to know that my software startup is the real deal. He is going to sit right on that velvet couch and write us a seed check for $5 million on the spot." Richard swallowed hard, desperately wanting to believe the beautiful lie. "5 million. Richard repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "5 million minimum," Jamal confirmed, slapping Richard on the back. "You are a genius for backing me, Dad. By Monday morning, you will be able to pay off that home equity loan and buy Patricia a yacht if you want to. Trust the process." Richard finally offered a weak, shaky smile, the gaslighting having worked its dark magic to perfection. Patricia chimed in from the kitchen, opening a massive sub-zero refrigerator. "See, Richard?" she said, her voice echoing off the marble. "Jamal is taking us to the next level. We just have to cut off the dead weight holding us back." As if summoned by her nasty comment, a loud, sharp chime echoed through the house. The doorbell. Richard jumped slightly, his nerves still clearly frayed. He checked his gold watch, looking confused. "Is that the catering company already?" he muttered, walking briskly toward the massive oak front doors. They were not supposed to be here until noon tomorrow. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled the door wide open. The forced polite smile he had prepared for a delivery driver instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. I was standing on the front porch of my own house. I was not wearing designer clothes or flashing my wealth. I wore a simple pair of faded denim jeans and a plain black t-shirt, looking exactly like the discarded, useless daughter they had kicked out into the freezing rain just days ago. I kept my hands casually in my pockets, offering my father a small, entirely empty smile. Richard physically lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into the doorway to block me from stepping 1 foot inside the extravagant foyer. His face twisted into a mask of absolute fury and disgust. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard spat, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "Did you follow us to beg for money?" From deep inside the luxurious living room, Jamal heard the commotion. He peeked his head around the corner, his eyes narrowing the second he spotted me standing on the porch. "Call the cops!" Jamal shouted, his voice echoing loudly through the massive estate. "Do not let that loser ruin my billionaire aesthetic." I did not flinch at Jamal shouting from the living room. I simply stood my ground on the imported cedar planks of the front porch. Richard braced his hands against the doorframe, his knuckles turning white as he physically blocked the entryway. He breathed heavily, a mixture of panic and pure rage radiating from him. He expected me to push, to yell, to beg for my old bedroom back. He expected the desperate, approval-starved daughter he had conditioned me to be. Instead, I remained perfectly still. I did not try to force my way inside. I just tilted my head slightly, looking right past his rigid shoulder into the magnificent great room of my estate. The afternoon sun was catching the edges of the cascading crystal chandelier I had specially commissioned from Milan. The light fractured across the flawless Italian marble floors. It was my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of my hard work and success. Seeing these greedy imposters standing in the middle of it, playing dress-up with money they did not actually have, was the most profound irony of my life. "What, are you deaf?" Richard snarled, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "I said get off this property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Before I could answer, heavy, uneven footsteps echoed from the foyer. Vanessa waddled to the door, shoving her way past our father's shoulder. She glared at me with an expression of absolute disgust, looking me up and down. She took in my faded denim jeans and plain black t-shirt, completely missing the fact that my casual attire was a deliberate choice. In her mind, my lack of visible logos confirmed my utter defeat. "You are pathetic, Riley," Vanessa spat, crossing her arms over her pregnant belly. "You just could not stand the fact that Jamal is successful, could you? You had to follow us all the way out here to ruin our weekend just because your own life is a miserable failure." She unclasped her designer purse, the one I recognized from my last credit card statement, before I cut them off. She dug her manicured fingers into the pristine leather interior and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. With a dramatic, theatrical sigh, she tossed the money directly at my feet. The bill fluttered through the crisp ocean breeze and landed on the cedar deck next to my worn sneakers. "Take this and catch the bus back to whatever slum you are sleeping in," Vanessa commanded, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are a toxic, jealous failure, and you are officially banned from my child's life. Do not ever come near my family again." A year ago, that declaration would have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I would have dropped to my knees, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, desperate to remain an aunt to my future nephew. I would have emptied my bank accounts just to buy back their conditional affection. But standing there today, feeling the solid wood of my own porch beneath my feet, I felt nothing but a chilling clinical detachment. They were no longer my family. They were parasites, and they had just gleefully locked themselves inside the jar. I did not argue. I did not defend my career or my bank account. I kept my eyes locked on my sister as I slowly, deliberately bent down. I picked up the crumpled $50 bill from the wooden deck. I smoothed the corners out with my thumbs, taking my time letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. I folded the money neatly and slipped it into the front pocket of my jeans. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Every dollar counts these days." I shifted my gaze away from her confused, furious face and looked deep into the house. My eyes bypassed the expensive artwork and settled directly on the magnificent custom glass dining table sitting in the center of the formal dining room. It was an irreplaceable piece cut from a single slab of reinforced crystal worth roughly the same amount my father had just borrowed against his house. "I will leave," I said, maintaining my eerily calm tone. "Just a friendly warning, the owner of this house is absolutely ruthless. Be careful with the furniture." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, entirely missing the double meaning of my words. He puffed out his chest, desperate to assert his dominance over the situation. "We are paying $25,000 for the weekend, Riley. I think the owner will be more than happy with us. Now get off my porch." He slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. The sheer force of it rattled the brass hinges and echoed out toward the crashing waves. I stood on the porch for one more second, listening to the heavy deadbolt click firmly into place. A genuine smile finally broke across my face. I turned on my heel and walked away, my sneakers crunching softly against the gravel driveway. The salty ocean breeze whipped through my hair, carrying the scent of impending victory. I walked past the rented Maybach, past the meticulously manicured hedges, and out through the towering iron security gates. Waiting quietly on the shoulder of the private coastal road was an unmarked, heavily tinted black SUV. The rear passenger door swung open as I approached. I climbed into the plush leather seat and pulled the door shut, cocooning myself in the quiet interior. David was sitting in the front passenger seat, adjusting his headset. He gave me a sharp nod, acknowledging that the bait had been taken perfectly. Our property manager disguise had worked flawlessly, and my family was completely oblivious to the legal landmines surrounding them. I reached into my bag and pulled out my iPad. I tapped the screen, entering my encrypted passcode. The display instantly lit up, dividing into a grid of 24 high-definition video feeds. The entire Hamptons estate was wired. Every room, every hallway, every outdoor patio was covered by state-of-the-art microscopic security cameras. On the screen, I watched Jamal strut back into the living room, grabbing a bottle of my vintage champagne from the wine fridge as if he had earned it. I watched my father pace nervously around the custom glass table I had just explicitly warned them about, still sweating over the immense debt he had taken on to be there. I watched Vanessa collapse onto a white velvet sofa, blissfully unaware that every single arrogant word she spoke was being recorded and archived on our private servers. I leaned back against the leather headrest, resting the iPad on my lap, and watched the high-resolution footage stream in real time. The pieces were all on the board, the doors were locked from the inside. The show was finally about to begin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Manhattan skyline in shades of bruised purple, the real entertainment began. I sat completely still beside David in my office, both of us leaning slightly toward the glowing grid of the surveillance monitors. The high-definition cameras mounted discreetly inside the smoke detectors and lighting fixtures throughout the Hamptons estate captured the transition from sunset to evening with crystal clarity. The custom ambient lighting I had personally selected automatically illuminated the grand living room, highlighting the imported Italian marble, the pristine white velvet upholstery, and the original artwork gracing the walls. Every angle was covered. We had perfect audio and perfect visuals. It was like watching a tragic comedy unfold on a custom-built stage. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy wrought iron gates of the driveway swung open to admit a convoy of vehicles. On the main feed, I could see Richard pacing frantically in the foyer. He was straightening his expensive silk tie, wiping sweat from his brow. and adjusting his posture to properly greet the billionaire venture capitalist Jamal had so boldly promised. Patricia was rushing around the dining room fussing over the $5,000 catering spread she had ordered, arranging the delicate pastries with military precision. They were preparing for royalty. But the people spilling out of the heavily tinted SUVs were absolutely not Wall Street titans. A chorus of loud, obnoxious cheering echoed through the exterior microphones. Half a dozen men stumbled up the pristine stone walkway, clutching cheap beers and wearing backward baseball caps, oversized sports jerseys, and scuffed sneakers. They were Jamal's old college fraternity brothers, a group of notoriously unmotivated slackers who still communicated primarily in sports analogies and grunts. They tracked sand and dirt directly onto the immaculate front steps. Right in the middle of the pack, wearing a skin-tight, glittering red cocktail dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, was the woman from the cheap roadside motel. Jamal threw the front double doors wide open, welcoming his chaotic entourage with open arms. He grabbed the motel mistress by the waist and proudly paraded her into the foyer. "Mom." Dad Jamal bellowed, his voice already slurring heavily from the pre-game drinks he had undoubtedly consumed in the Maybach. "I want you to meet my executive assistant, Crystal. She handles all the complex logistics for the startup. And these guys right here are my silent partners." On the screen, Richard looked like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac event. He stared at the rowdy group of men tracking mud onto the white marble floor, his eyes darting frantically between them and the expensive miniature caviar tarts arranged on the crystal dining table. Patricia forced a tight, horrified smile, her hands clasping nervously in front of her chest. She was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of high society, while a group of overgrown frat boys treated the $15 million estate like a cheap rental cabin. They were entirely trapped by their own greed, too afraid to offend the men they believed held the key to a $5 million investment. The situation deteriorated with breathtaking speed. Within an hour, the carefully curated investor retreat had completely devolved into a catastrophic frat party. The heavy bass of a club anthem vibrated through the hidden audio feeds, rattling the expensive glassware in the cabinets. Empty beer cans were tossed carelessly onto the custom white velvet sofas. Crystal, the supposed executive assistant, was draped heavily over Jamal's lap, giggling loudly as he fed her imported macarons. They were completely ignoring the fact that his actual pregnant wife, Vanessa, was supposedly resting in the master suite upstairs. Or perhaps Vanessa was simply too absorbed in taking perfectly angled selfies in the luxurious bathroom to notice the blatant infidelity happening right below her feet. The true climax of the evening occurred just before midnight. Jamal, heavily intoxicated and sweating profusely through his wrinkled linen suit, decided the party needed a grand gesture. He climbed aggressively onto the edge of the custom glass dining table, his hard leather shoes scraping against the delicate crystal surface. He held a massive, oversized bottle of premium champagne, shaking it vigorously above his head like a race car driver celebrating a championship victory. To the future billionaires of America, Jamal screamed at the top of his lungs, drawing a deafening roar of approval from his drunken friends. He popped the cork. The intense pressure inside the vigorously shaken bottle launched the dense cork with the velocity of a small bullet. The camera angle caught the exact devastating trajectory. The cork flew directly across the expansive room and slammed straight into the center of a gorgeous original Renaissance-era oil painting hanging directly above the floating fireplace. The sound of tearing ancient canvas echoed sharply through the audio feed. A massive, jagged hole now ruined the $40,000 masterpiece. The loud music suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the living room. Patricia let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, dropping her wineglass onto the marble floor where it shattered into a dozen pieces. Richard stumbled backward, his hands clutching his chest. He began hyperventilating, his eyes bulging as he stared in absolute horror at the destroyed artwork. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Richard gasped, struggling to pull air into his panicked lungs. "That painting looks like an antique. The security deposit on this place is astronomical." If the owner sees that they will charge us thousands of dollars, we are already stretched to the absolute limit. Jamal simply wiped a splash of sticky champagne from his face and let out a loud, completely unbothered laugh. He hopped down from the glass table, entirely disregarding the sheer panic radiating from his father-in-law. "Relax, old man," Jamal scoffed, waving a dismissive hand at the ruined canvas. "The landlord is probably some absent idiot who never even visits this place. Their insurance will cover it. Stop sweating over pennies. I'm about to make you a millionaire tomorrow anyway. Just grab another bottle and enjoy the ride." I sat in the dim light of my penthouse office watching the high-resolution screen with absolutely dead, unblinking eyes. The sheer audacity of the parasite standing in my home, destroying my property, and gaslighting the very man who was bankrolling his fraudulent existence was almost impressive. Almost. I did not scream. I did not throw anything in anger. I simply picked up my encrypted cell phone and dialed a highly restricted direct line to my wealth management division. "Banking operations, this is Gregory," a crisp professional voice answered immediately. "Gregory, it is Riley," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely lethal. "I need you to access the collateral profile for Richard Wilson. Execute the total freeze on his primary and secondary accounts immediately. Furthermore, authorize the immediate withdrawal of the strict liability damage penalty clause attached to his Hamptons rental contract. Drain the account to cover the cost of a $40,000 piece of ruined art." I looked back at the glowing screen, watching my father desperately try to clean up the spilled champagne with a cloth napkin, while Jamal and his mistress laughed in the background. "Process the transaction right now," I commanded softly. "Let him wake up to an absolute zero balance." I watched the confirmation light up my secondary monitor. The transfer was initiated, the funds seized, and Richard's remaining credit lines frozen solid. He was officially bankrupt, though he would not discover the reality of his ruin until he tried to swipe his platinum card. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the volume on my headset as the chaos inside my estate entered its final catastrophic act. As midnight bled into the early hours of Saturday morning, the frat party from hell escalated from obnoxious to downright destructive. The expensive bottles of liquor my mother had purchased on Richard's doomed credit card were entirely depleted. Jamal and his friends were completely unhinged, fueled by cheap beer they had brought in coolers and an arrogant sense of invincibility. They had turned the grand living room into a wrestling ring. Two of Jamal's friends, heavily tattooed and dangerously intoxicated, began shoving each other playfully near the floating fireplace. The shoving quickly escalated into a full-blown grappling match. Jamal, cheering them on with a slurred roar, jumped into the fray. He grabbed one of his friends in a headlock, stumbling backward as the sheer weight of three grown men shifted out of control. They lost their footing on the imported marble. I watched in cold silence as the trio careened directly toward the formal dining room. They crashed violently into the custom-reinforced crystal dining table. The impact was deafening. The $80,000 masterpiece, a table I had flown to Italy to personally select, gave way under their combined weight. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending an explosive shower of thick, glittering glass flying across the room. The music seemed to cut out in my mind as the disastrous reality of the scene unfolded. Jamal and his friends groaned, rolling around in the glittering wreckage, entirely oblivious to the monumental financial damage they had just inflicted. "What is going on down here?" A shrill voice pierced the air. Vanessa appeared at the top of the grand staircase, wrapped in a silk robe, her face twisted in a furious scowl. She heavily waddled down the marble steps barefoot, intending to scream at Jamal for waking her. She stormed into the dining area without looking down. A sharp shriek echoed through the house. Vanessa staggered backward, clutching her foot. A tiny, almost microscopic shard of the shattered crystal had grazed the bottom of her heel. It was a superficial scratch, barely drawing a drop of blood, but Vanessa reacted as if she had stepped on a landmine. "I am bleeding!" she wailed dramatically, leaning against the wall and pointing an accusing finger at the drunken men on the floor. "Look what you did. You are endangering a pregnant woman. You are endangering your own child, Jamal. This place is a death trap." Patricia rushed into the room from the kitchen, her face pale with terror. She immediately dropped to her knees beside Vanessa, fussing over the microscopic scratch with a cloth napkin, treating it like a mortal wound. Richard, however, did not look at his daughter. He was staring at the massive pile of shattered crystal that used to be a dining table. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly. The delusion he had been desperately clinging to finally fractured. The sheer insurmountable cost of the damages was staring him right in the face. He lunged forward. Richard grabbed Jamal by the collar of his ruined linen shirt, hauling the younger man halfway off the floor. "Do you have any idea how much this will cost me?" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "First a painting and now this table. This is custom imported glass. You are destroying this house. You are destroying my life. How am I supposed to pay for this?" For a fraction of a second, Jamal looked startled, but the shock vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating aggression. He violently shoved Richard in the chest, forcing the older man to stumble backward and release his grip. Jamal stood up, brushing glass off his pants, towering over my father. He flipped the script with textbook narcissistic precision. "Are you seriously doubting me right now?" Jamal snarled, stepping into Richard's personal space and pointing a finger directly at his face. "I am carrying this entire family on my back. I brought you into this deal out of the goodness of my heart. I let you finance this weekend so you could share in the glory. And this is how you repay me, by crying over a piece of broken glass." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Jamal cut him off, his voice rising to a vicious shout. "If you stress me out before Mr. Cole gets here tomorrow, I will cancel the paperwork. I will cut you out of the equity completely. You will not see a single dime of the $5 million. I will let you drown in your own debt. Do you understand me, Richard? Do you want to be a billionaire, or do you want to cry over furniture?" The threat hit Richard like a physical blow. The fight instantly drained out of him. He was a man suspended over a cliff, and Jamal was threatening to cut the rope. He could not afford to lose the promised investment. He had already sacrificed everything for it. "No," Richard stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "No, Jamal. I am sorry. I just panicked. Please do not change the deal. I trust you. I am with you." Jamal sneered, adjusting his collar. "Then clean up this mess, old man, and keep your mouth shut." I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitors with dead, unblinking eyes. Richard had just willingly submitted to a con artist, trading his last shred of dignity for a lottery ticket that did not exist. I closed my laptop screen. The trap was fully set. Morning broke over the Hamptons with a bright, unforgiving light. The golden sunshine streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, illuminating the absolute devastation within. The living room looked like the aftermath of a riot. Empty beer cans and sticky champagne puddles littered the white velvet sofas. The $40,000 Renaissance painting hung in tatters. The $80,000 crystal table remained a glittering mountain of debris in the dining room. Several of Jamal's friends were passed out on the floor, snoring loudly. Jamal was asleep on the sofa, his mouth hanging open, entirely unbothered by the ruins surrounding him. Richard was slumped in an armchair, staring blankly at the wall, looking like a man who had not slept a single second. Outside, the silent tranquility of the coastal morning was interrupted by the smooth, quiet purr of a high-end engine. I watched from the exterior gate camera as a vehicle approached. It was a sleek, perfectly polished silver Rolls-Royce. The heavy tires rolled smoothly over the gravel driveway, coming to a graceful stop directly in front of the main entrance. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. A tall, distinguished man in an impeccable custom-tailored suit stepped onto the driveway, adjusting his cuffs as he looked up at the magnificent but deeply compromised estate. Mr. Cole, the investor, had arrived. Mr. Cole stood beside the open door of his silver Rolls-Royce, his sharp slate-gray eyes scanning the exterior of the estate. He was a man in his late 60s who exuded the kind of quiet, dangerous power that only billions of dollars in liquid assets could buy. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his bespoke charcoal suit did not bear a single wrinkle. He possessed an intimidating stillness, absorbing every detail of his surroundings, with a predatory precision that made my heart race with dark anticipation. I sat in the back of my tinted SUV parked down the road, my eyes glued to the iPad screen, watching the feed from the driveway security camera. Inside the house, sheer panic erupted. The heavy oak front doors burst open, and Jamal scrambled out onto the front stone steps. He was a disastrous, humiliating sight. He had haphazardly thrown a wrinkled blazer over a sweat-stained button-down shirt. Even through the camera feed, I could vividly imagine the heavy, sour stench of stale beer, cheap liquor, and unwashed desperation radiating from him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face puffy from the night of excessive drinking and property destruction. Jamal breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he desperately positioned his body to completely block the open doorway. He spread his arms, slightly terrified that Mr. Cole might catch a glimpse of the absolute carnage lurking in the formal dining room just a few yards away. The $80,000 crystal table was still a mountain of jagged debris, and the ruined Renaissance painting hung like a shredded flag of defeat. "Mr. Cole!" Jamal practically shouted, his voice cracking with artificial, overblown enthusiasm. "Welcome to the Hamptons. We are incredibly thrilled to have you here at our little weekend getaway." Mr. Cole did not smile. He simply stared at Jamal, his gaze dropping to the visible scuff marks on Jamal's loafers and the dark, unidentifiable stain on his collar. He looked at Jamal the way one might look at a rodent that had wandered into a Michelin-starred restaurant. "Right," Mr. Cole replied, his tone entirely unreadable, laced with a freezing, polite detachment. "Shall we step inside and discuss the terms of my potential investment?" Jamal physically flinched, his eyes darting back toward the chaotic foyer. "No need to go inside," he said quickly, his voice pitching up a nervous octave. "It is an absolutely gorgeous morning. Let us head straight around to the back patio. The ocean views are phenomenal right now. My staff is currently doing a massive deep clean of the interior anyway. We really want to enjoy the fresh air." Without waiting for a response, Jamal aggressively ushered the billionaire away from the front doors, steering him around the side of the massive property. Behind them, Richard and Patricia emerged from the house, pulling the heavy oak doors firmly shut to hide the shattered glass and ruined art. My father looked physically ill. His skin was a ghastly shade of gray, and his hands trembled visibly as he walked. Patricia clutched his arm, her knuckles white, her face stretched into a terrified, rigid smile. They were holding their breath, their entire financial future, their home, their retirement hanging by a single fragile thread. The group settled onto the expansive back patio. Mr. Cole took a seat in a custom teak lounge chair, crossing his legs and resting his hands calmly on his knees. He looked completely at ease, a stark contrast to Jamal, who was pacing frantically back and forth against the backdrop of the crashing Atlantic waves. I switched my iPad view to the patio camera, turning the volume up. Jamal cleared his throat loudly, clapping his hands together. He launched into his pitch, projecting the false aggressive confidence of a desperate man cornered by his own lies. "Our platform is going to completely revolutionize the entire digital landscape." Jamal began pacing faster and gesturing wildly. "We are talking about seamless blockchain integration, utilizing a highly proprietary cloud-based infrastructure. By leveraging decentralized networks, we are going to synergize vertical markets and create a massive paradigm shift in user data management. Our SaaS integration protocols are completely unparalleled in the current market space. We are not just building software, Mr. Cole. We are building a dynamic global ecosystem." It was a spectacular display of absolute nonsense. Jamal was stringing together expensive-sounding buzzwords he had clearly memorized from tech blogs, hoping the sheer volume of jargon would mask the fact that he had no actual product, no team, and no talent. Richard stood near the edge of the patio, nodding eagerly at every word Jamal said, acting as if his son-in-law was delivering a profound gospel truth. Patricia mirrored his enthusiasm, completely blind to the hollow amateur nature of the presentation. They were waiting for the promised $5 million check, entirely convinced that Jamal was successfully charming the billionaire. Mr. Cole let Jamal speak for exactly 5 minutes. He did not nod. He did not take notes. He just watched Jamal sweat in the morning sun, letting the silence stretch whenever Jamal paused for breath. Then Mr. Cole raised a single hand, his index finger extended. The gesture was so sharp, so implicitly authoritative, that Jamal instantly snapped his mouth shut. "I have read your prospectus," Mr. Cole said, his voice cutting through the sound of the ocean waves like a finely sharpened blade. "I have had my engineering team run a comprehensive diagnostic on the back-end schematics you submitted to my firm last week." Jamal swallowed hard, a nervous, sick smile twitching on his lips. "Outstanding," he replied, trying to sound victorious. "Then you know we are sitting on an absolute goldmine." "I know no such thing," Mr. Cole countered coldly, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "I know that the technical architecture you presented is not revolutionary. In fact, it is entirely derivative. Your foundational algorithms, your security protocols, and your specific SaaS integration frameworks are virtually identical to the proprietary code developed by a company called Apex Solutions." The color instantly drained from Jamal's face. His arrogant posture collapsed. He looked like a man who had just confidently stepped off a ledge into thin air. Richard shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Mr. Cole, I am sure there is a perfectly reasonable explanation." Richard interjected, his voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. He was terrified of losing his investment, oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were already frozen solid. Mr. Cole ignored my father completely, keeping his piercing gaze locked directly on Jamal. "Apex Solutions holds the absolute copyright to that specific digital architecture," Mr. Cole stated, his tone growing sharper and significantly more menacing. "How exactly do you explain presenting another company's highly classified intellectual property as your own original startup venture?" Jamal began to stammer, wiping a fresh layer of nervous sweat from his forehead. He backed away slightly, desperately trying to salvage his grand illusion through sheer audacity. "There is a lot of overlap in the industry," Jamal lied, his voice pitching higher as he grew more aggressive. "It is a shared foundational concept, but the code is mine. I practically co-wrote the original architecture during my early consulting days. I own the rights to those specific integration protocols. Apex just utilized my groundwork. It is completely legal, I assure you. I am the creator." Mr. Cole leaned back in his teak chair. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly amused. A cold, terrifying smile slowly touched the corners of his mouth. He looked past the sweating, desperate con artist and glanced toward the long driveway. "Fascinating," Mr. Cole said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "Because the actual owner of that intellectual property is currently waiting in my car, and she would love to hear exactly how you co-wrote her life's work." Cole's words hung in the salty morning air, sharp and precise. Jamal blinked, his bloodshot eyes darting nervously toward the silver Rolls-Royce idling in the driveway. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. Richard and Patricia exchanged bewildered glances, entirely unequipped to process the rapid unraveling of their financial savior. From the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, I watched the scene unfold on my encrypted monitor for one final, deeply satisfying second before tossing the tablet aside. It was time. I pushed the heavy, reinforced rear door open. My foot emerged first, the signature red sole of my Christian Louboutin heel, making a sharp, deliberate crunch against the immaculate gravel of the driveway. I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving the dark-tinted security of the vehicle behind. I had dressed for an execution. I wore a tailored power red blazer that cut a striking silhouette against the coastal backdrop, paired with matching trousers and a crisp silk blouse. My hair, normally pulled back into the messy bun my family associated with my supposed data entry job, was flawlessly styled in sleek cascading waves. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter who could barely pay her rent. I looked like a woman who could buy and sell the entire Hamptons coastline before breakfast. I radiated absolute, unyielding authority. I walked with slow, measured steps around the side of the expansive estate, my heels clicking rhythmically against the expensive stone pavers. I passed the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, deliberately ignoring the catastrophic mountain of shattered crystal dining table and the torn canvas of the ruined painting. My eyes remained locked on the patio ahead. Patricia had just emerged from the kitchen carrying a heavy silver tray, laden with fresh coffee and expensive pastries, her final desperate attempt to charm the man holding their future. She took one step onto the wooden deck and froze. Her eyes locked onto my red blazer. She blinked rapidly, her mind violently rejecting the image standing before her. The silver tray slipped from her trembling hands. It hit the wooden deck with a deafening crash, sending steaming hot coffee porcelain shards and delicate pastries flying in every direction. The loud clatter jolted the rest of the patio, Vanessa, still clutching her superficially scratched foot in a luxury lounge chair nearby, whipped her head around. Her jaw literally dropped open, her eyes bulging as she took in my designer clothes and commanding posture. She looked as though she had seen a ghost rising from the ocean. Richard spun around his face, instantly transforming from pale terror to a mottled beet-red fury. He marched forward, his hands balled into tight fists, completely ignoring the fact that his supposed billionaire investor was sitting just a few feet away. The ingrained habit of treating me like an unwanted nuisance was simply too strong for him to break. "Riley, what kind of sick prank is this?" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing harshly over the sound of the crashing Atlantic waves. His eyes darted nervously between me and Mr. Cole. "Get out of here before you ruin Jamal's deal. Are you completely out of your mind? We are in the middle of a critical meeting. Go back to your apartment immediately." He reached out, fully intending to grab my arm and physically drag me away from his golden child's moment of triumph. I did not even look at him. I simply kept walking, slicing right past my father, as if he were nothing more than a mild gust of wind. I left him standing there, his arm outstretched, his face contorted in sputtering rage. I walked straight to the center of the patio table where Jamal had spread out his beautifully bound, high-gloss presentation materials. Jamal stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He reeked of cheap beer and profound panic. I picked up the thick, glossy pitch deck. The cover prominently displayed the stolen back-end schematics, the exact code I had spent 3 years writing in my cramped city apartment, while they laughed at my supposed failure. I held the document up, looking directly into Jamal's bloodshot, terrified eyes. I gripped the thick binding with both hands and tore the pitch deck violently in half. The sound of ripping paper cut sharply through the morning air. I dropped the shredded pieces onto the deck, letting them scatter over the spilled coffee. "Mr. Cole does not invest in stolen property, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth, lethal, and entirely devoid of emotion. For a second, the entire patio was frozen in a tableau of absolute shock. Then the realization of what was actually happening finally broke through Jamal's alcohol-soaked brain. His entire fraudulent empire, his massive ego, and his desperate scam were evaporating right in front of him. He lost his mind. Jamal lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged aggression. His hands curled into fists, looking for a moment like he might actually try to strike me. He pointed a trembling finger inches from my face, spit flying from his lips as he screamed, "You crazy bitch!" Jamal roared, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "Who do you think you are? You are a nobody. You are a delusional, pathetic data entry clerk who cannot even afford her own rent. You are trying to sabotage my company because you are jealous. Mr. Cole, do not listen to her. She is mentally unstable. She has been trying to ruin my life since I married her sister. I wrote that code. I built this company. She is a massive fraud." Mr. Cole stood up. The movement was neither fast nor aggressive, but it carried such immense crushing weight that Jamal instantly stopped shouting. The older man straightened his suit jacket, his cold gray eyes locking onto the sweating, frantic con artist. When Mr. Cole spoke, his voice boomed across the patio like a crack of thunder, silencing the ocean itself. "Do not speak to my boss that way," Mr. Cole commanded, the sheer, unrelenting authority in his tone, forcing Jamal to physically take a step back, his bravado crumbling into dust. "Ms. Riley is the founder and CEO of Apex Solutions. You are pitching stolen code to the billionaire who wrote it." The sheer magnitude of Mr. Cole's declaration hung in the salty morning air, suffocating the life out of Jamal's fraudulent dreams. The realization hit Richard like a runaway freight train. I watched his eyes dart wildly from Mr. Cole to the open door of the Rolls-Royce to the shredded pitch deck scattered across the coffee-stained wood of the deck. The dots were finally connecting in his mind, drawing a brutal, undeniable picture that he had spent his entire life refusing to see. The daughter he had deemed a pathetic data entry clerk, the woman he had evicted from his home and confidently labeled a massive failure, was the sole architect of the very technology his supposed savior had stolen. From the back seat of the Rolls-Royce, I pushed the heavy reinforced door open. My foot emerged first, the signature red sole of my Christian Louboutin heel, making a sharp, deliberate crunch against the immaculate gravel of the driveway. I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving the dark, tinted security of the vehicle behind. I had dressed for an execution. I wore a tailored power red blazer that cut a striking silhouette against the coastal backdrop, paired with matching trousers and a crisp silk blouse. My hair, normally pulled back into the messy bun my family associated with my supposed entry-level job, was flawlessly styled in sleek, cascading waves. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter who could barely pay her rent. I looked like a woman who could buy and sell the entire Hamptons coastline before breakfast. I radiated absolute unyielding authority. I walked with slow, measured steps around the side of the expansive estate, my heels clicking rhythmically against the expensive stone pavers. I passed the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, deliberately ignoring the catastrophic mountain of shattered crystal dining table and the torn canvas of the ruined painting. My eyes remained locked on the patio ahead. Patricia had just emerged from the kitchen carrying a heavy silver tray laden with fresh coffee and expensive pastries, her final desperate attempt to charm the man holding their future. She took one step onto the wooden deck and froze. Her eyes locked onto my red blazer. She blinked rapidly, her mind violently rejecting the image standing before her. The silver tray slipped from her trembling hands. It hit the wooden deck with a deafening crash, sending steaming hot coffee porcelain shards and delicate pastries flying in every direction. Total silence fell over the patio. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, relentless crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shoreline, and the harsh, ragged breathing of my brother-in-law. Patricia, ever the opportunistic chameleon, was the first to break the stunned, heavy silence. The absolute horror that had frozen her features melted away in an instant, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured smile. She stepped forward carefully, tiptoeing over the porcelain shards of the coffee cups she had just dropped in shock. Her hands were clasped together tightly against her chest in a gesture of profound fake maternal pride. She was attempting to rewrite history on the spot. "Sweetheart," Patricia gasped, her voice dripping with artificial affection and desperate damage control. "You are a CEO. Why didn't you tell Mommy? We had absolutely no idea you were doing so well. We are so incredibly proud of you, Riley. We always knew you were destined for greatness. You always had such a brilliant mind." I turned my head slowly, letting my gaze sweep over my mother. The sheer audacity of her pivot was almost impressive, but it only fueled the cold, righteous fire burning in my chest. I did not smile. I did not acknowledge her outstretched, welcoming arms. I looked right through her, letting the silence stretch until her fake smile faltered, and she nervously lowered her hands, stepping back toward my father. I shifted my attention back to Richard. He was staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe, the authoritarian patriarch completely dismantled by the reality of my overwhelming success. "Dad, didn't you say failures don't belong in your family?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly over the ocean breeze, sharp and unyielding. I tilted my head, studying his pale, sweating face, watching the muscles in his jaw twitch. "I agree." I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot across the quiet morning patio. From the side path of the expansive estate, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was David. Gone were the rugged work boots, the faded canvas jacket, and the heavy leather tool belt he had worn when he posed as the estate's contractor earlier that week. He was now dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, carrying a sleek leather clipboard and a high-end tablet. He walked onto the patio with the predatory confidence of a seasoned corporate litigator who was about to close a flawless, inescapable trap. He stopped right beside me, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at my ruined family. Richard blinked, visibly confused by the sudden appearance of the man he had previously dismissed as mere hired help. "What is going on?" Richard stammered, pointing a shaking liver-spotted finger at David. "Who is this man? Why is the contractor wearing a suit? What kind of game are you playing with us, Riley?" David offered a razor-thin, entirely humorless smile. "Allow me to reintroduce myself, Mr. Wilson. My name is David Sterling. I am the lead corporate counsel for Apex Solutions, and I also serve as the primary legal representative for Oceanfront LLC. David tapped his expensive pen against the leather clipboard, the sound sharp and authoritative, demanding absolute attention. "You signed a binding short-term luxury rental agreement with Oceanfront LLC for the use of this Hamptons property. As part of my duties, I manage the legal and financial protections for the owner of that specific holding company." David gestured respectfully toward me, his posture shifting to one of utmost deference. "Ms. Riley is the sole proprietor of Oceanfront LLC. You are currently standing on her property." The blood drained entirely from Richard's face. His mouth opened but no sound came out. He looked back at the sprawling $15 million mansion rising up behind us, then back to me, the absolute horror of his situation finally locking into place. He had rented a luxury estate to impress a billionaire, putting his entire financial future on the line, only to discover he was renting it from the daughter he had disowned and discarded. He was completely trapped in my web. "And that brings us to the matter of the property damages." David continued, his voice crisp, relentless, and cutting through the salty air. "Based on the live high-definition security footage we reviewed overnight, you and your unauthorized guests have caused extensive malicious destruction to my client's property. The complete loss of an imported custom, reinforced crystal dining table. The irreparable destruction of an original, authenticated Renaissance-era oil painting. Extensive fluid damage to custom white velvet upholstery and imported Italian marble flooring. Factoring in the immediate biohazard cleanup required after last night's frat party, the total comes to exactly $120,000. Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical sob, burying her face in her hands and sinking into the patio chair. Jamal was entirely catatonic, staring blankly at the shredded remains of his stolen pitch deck fluttering in the breeze. Richard stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a glass patio table. He gripped the edge desperately to keep himself from collapsing onto the wooden deck. His chest heaved as he frantically tried to calculate a way out of the financial abyss yawning open beneath him. He was a man who had built his entire identity on control and financial superiority, and now he was drowning in a trap of his own arrogant making. "Fine." Richard laughed, a harsh, nervous sound that bordered on sheer, unadulterated panic. "Fine. Take the damages from the security deposit. I do not care. I have the money. I took out a $200,000 home equity loan specifically for this weekend. The funds are sitting right there in my primary checking account. Take your $120,000 and let us be done with this absurd charade. You will get your money, Riley." David did not miss a beat. He smoothly lifted his tablet, tapping the screen a few times to wake up the display before looking back up at my father with an expression of profound surgical pity. It was the look a predator gives its prey right before the final strike. "Ah, about that, Mr. Wilson," David said, his voice smooth and deadly calm. "Your bank processed the damage penalty at exactly 3 o'clock this morning. However, due to insufficient funds, the transaction bounced entirely." Richard froze, his eyes bulging out of his skull. "What are you talking about?" "I just told you the loan cleared yesterday morning. I checked the balance myself." David smiled coldly, holding the tablet out so Richard could see the red, glaring numbers on the screen. "The loan cleared, yes. But your bank processed the penalty right after another massive withdrawal. Due to insufficient funds, the transaction bounced. Your account is completely overdrawn." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard stared at the glowing tablet screen, his eyes tracking the glaring red negative balance. His mind struggled to comprehend the sheer impossibility of the numbers. He had personally approved the $200,000 transfer yesterday afternoon. It was supposed to be safely secured in Jamal's corporate holding account, acting as the final proof of his loyalty to the investment deal. Another massive withdrawal. Richard repeated, his voice barely a raspy whisper. He slowly turned his head, his gaze fixing on the sweating, disheveled man standing a few feet away. Jamal immediately took a step back, his hands raised defensively. The arrogant bravado he had displayed just moments ago had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. Richard moved with a sudden explosive violence that belied his age. He lunged across the wooden deck, grabbing Jamal fiercely by the collar of his ruined linen shirt. The fabric tore slightly under his desperate grip. "Where is the $200,000? Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he shook the younger man. "I transferred it to your business account yesterday. I drained my equity. I mortgaged my entire future for you. Where is my money?" Jamal choked, his hands weakly grasping at Richard's wrists. He tried to puff out his chest, desperately clinging to the illusion of control. "It is tied up in the blockchain infrastructure." Jamal gasped, his eyes darting frantically toward Mr. Cole, who watched the scene with absolute clinical detachment. "It is a liquidity lockup period. You cannot just withdraw seed capital overnight. That is not how venture capitalism works." I stepped forward, my red Louboutins clicking sharply against the wooden deck. I had let the rat squirm long enough. "Let us see exactly where that seed capital went, shall we?" I said, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. I pulled my encrypted iPad from my leather tote bag and walked purposefully toward the massive 80-inch outdoor smart TV mounted above the custom patio bar. I tapped the screen twice, instantly syncing my device to the display. The screen flickered to life, casting a bright, high-definition glow over the frozen family gathering. "This is footage from the dashcam installed in my Honda Civic," I announced, turning to face my audience. "The same Honda Civic you all mocked me for driving. The same car Jamal generously offered to take to the mechanic for me while I was away." I hit play. The massive screen instantly filled with a crystal-clear wide-angle view of a dingy, neon-lit parking lot. It was the cheap roadside motel from 3 nights ago. The audio kicked in sharp and undeniable, capturing the ambient hum of the highway and the crunch of gravel. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She recognized the glittering red cocktail dress immediately. It was the same dress the supposed executive assistant had worn to the disastrous frat party inside the estate just hours ago. On the screen, Jamal strutted into the frame, completely unaware of the hidden camera recording his every move. He wrapped his arms tightly around Crystal's waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "Are you sure the transfer cleared, baby?" Crystal's voice echoed through the high-end patio speakers, dripping with greedy anticipation. Jamal threw his head back and laughed loudly, a sound so arrogant and ugly it made Patricia physically flinch. Of course it cleared, the digital version of Jamal boasted, dipping his head to press open-mouthed kisses along Crystal's neck. The stupid old man practically tripped over himself to sign the papers. He handed over his entire retirement fund because he is too desperate to feel important. 200 grand straight into my offshore account. He is a pathetic, gullible idiot. The audio continued to play, capturing the sickening sound of them kissing passionately against the hood of my car. Jamal bragged about bleeding the family dry, detailing exactly how he planned to string Vanessa along, just long enough to drain Patricia's secret savings accounts next. I paused the video, letting the frozen image of Jamal and his mistress lock onto the screen. The silence on the patio was absolute, thick with a horror so profound it felt suffocating. Vanessa stared at the screen, her entire body trembling violently. The illusion of her perfect marriage, her wealthy husband, and her superior life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at Jamal, the man who had promised her the world, and saw nothing but a parasitic thief who had stolen her father's future to fund his infidelity. "You bastard!" Vanessa shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat with a raw, agonizing ferocity. She lunged out of the patio chair, entirely disregarding her injured foot. She threw herself directly at Jamal, her manicured nails hooking like claws. She raked her hands across his face, tearing deep, bloody scratches down his cheeks. Jamal yelled in pain, raising his arms to protect his face. "Get off me, you crazy bitch," he shouted. Instead of trying to restrain her or apologize, the cornered narcissist reacted with pure physical aggression. Jamal planted his hands firmly on Vanessa's shoulders and shoved her violently backward. The force of the blow lifted her feet off the deck. Vanessa fell hard, crashing onto the wooden planks with a sickening thud, landing awkwardly on her side to protect her pregnant belly. Patricia screamed, rushing forward to drop to her knees beside her sobbing, devastated daughter. Richard witnessed Jamal strike his pregnant daughter, and something inside the older man completely snapped. The last remaining shred of his civilized corporate persona vanished, replaced by a blind, primal rage. He roared, pulling his fist back, and swung a heavy, desperate punch directly at Jamal's jaw. But Richard was 58 years old, exhausted and broken by the stress of the morning. Jamal was younger, heavier, and fueled by the adrenaline of a trapped predator. Jamal easily dodged the clumsy swing. He grabbed Richard by the lapels of his expensive blazer and hurled him sideways. Richard flew across the patio, crashing violently into one of the heavy stone pillars supporting the pergola. His head struck the masonry with a sharp crack, and he crumpled to the wooden deck, groaning in agony as he clutched his ribs. The patio erupted into absolute unchecked physical violence. Jamal stood over his ruined father-in-law, shouting profanities, his face bleeding from Vanessa's scratches. Patricia was weeping hysterically, clutching Vanessa, who lay curled in a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect life dissolved into ash. I stood precisely where I was, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly by my sides. I did not flinch when Vanessa screamed. I did not move when Richard hit the stone pillar. I simply watched them tear each other apart exactly as they had torn me apart for 30 years. They had built a family on lies, status, and cruelty, and I was merely the mirror forcing them to look at their own reflection. The fire was burning them to the ground, and I was cold as ice, completely untouched by the flames. Mr. Cole stepped smoothly around the chaos, buttoning his suit jacket. He offered me a brief, respectful nod, silently acknowledging the sheer ruthless efficiency of my operation. He walked calmly down the stone steps, sliding into the back of his waiting Rolls-Royce. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing him away from the garbage fire of the Wilson family. David moved to stand slightly in front of me, his posture vigilant, ensuring none of the physical violence spilled in my direction. Through the crisp morning air, cutting clearly over the sounds of Vanessa's weeping and Jamal's enraged shouting, a new noise began to rise. It started as a faint wail in the distance, growing louder and more urgent by the second. The sharp, piercing shriek of police sirens echoed down the coastal highway, rapidly approaching the heavy iron gates of the estate. The sharp, piercing shriek of police sirens echoed down the coastal highway, rapidly approaching the heavy iron gates of the estate. David had already triggered the remote access from his tablet. The massive iron gates swung open smoothly, offering no resistance to the law. 3 black and white police cruisers skidded up the pristine gravel driveway, their blue and red lights painting the manicured landscaping and the silver Rolls-Royce in frantic, flashing strokes. Tires crunched aggressively as the drivers threw the heavy vehicles into park. The doors burst open before the engines even fully shut off. Half a dozen uniformed officers swarmed the patio, their heavy black boots thudding loudly against the expensive wooden deck. David stepped smoothly aside, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. He had made the call exactly 10 minutes prior, perfectly timing the arrival of law enforcement to coincide with the inevitable physical and emotional implosion of Jamal's massive ego. The officers descended on the chaos with practiced, ruthless efficiency. 2 of the largest cops grabbed Jamal by his broad shoulders, prying his bloodied, furious face away from Richard's torn collar. Jamal thrashed like a wild, cornered animal, shouting incoherent profanities and throwing wild kicks, but the officers quickly overpowered him. They forced him face first against the nearest custom teak lounge chair, pressing his cheek roughly into the expensive cushions. Richard remained on the ground near the stone pillar, gasping for breath, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked up with a dazed, hopeful expression, expecting the police to assist him, the wealthy homeowner. Instead, he was entirely ignored by the very authorities he usually relied upon to enforce his upper-class privilege. A senior officer, tall, with a weathered face and an air of absolute authority, stepped past the writhing con artist. His eyes quickly scanned the shattered glass, the ruined art visible through the open doors, and the spilled coffee, before landing squarely on me. His posture shifted instantly, recognizing the calm, unbothered center of this hurricane. He approached me with clear, unmistakable respect. Ms. Riley, the officer, asked, his tone professional and highly deferential. "Is this the man who destroyed your property?" I nodded once, my expression perfectly smooth and cold. "Yes, officer. He also assaulted my father, as your men just witnessed when they arrived." Jamal twisted his neck, thrashing against the heavy grip of the cops holding him down. "She is a liar!" Jamal screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "That property belongs to him. That is my father-in-law. She is just a jealous, broke data entry clerk. Do not listen to her." The heavy click of metal handcuffs snapping shut over his wrists instantly cut off his pathetic tirade. David stepped forward seamlessly, inserting himself between me and the senior officer. He handed the cop a thick, meticulously organized manila folder bearing the Apex Solutions corporate seal. Officer David said, his voice carrying the lethal calm of a seasoned corporate prosecutor. "That folder contains verified time-stamped documentation of the property damage, including the live security feed. But more importantly, it contains irrefutable financial and digital evidence of federal wire fraud, highly classified intellectual property theft, and interstate grand larceny. We have already notified the Securities and Exchange Commission and the regional FBI field office. The local destruction of property charges are merely the appetizer." The word federal hit Jamal like a physical blow. The manic fight instantly drained out of his body. The arrogant, swaggering tech visionary vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a sweating, hyperventilating coward facing decades in a federal penitentiary. His knees practically buckled, fully supported only by the officers gripping his arms. He twisted his head, his terrified, bloodshot eyes seeking out the one person he had manipulated best. "Vanessa!" Jamal shrieked, his voice pitching into a pathetic, desperate whine that grated against my ears. "Vanessa, you have to help me. Call your father's lawyer right now. Get me bail money. You have to get me out of this. Tell them I am innocent." Vanessa did not move to help him. She sat crumpled on the wooden deck, clutching her pregnant belly, her designer maternity dress ruined by spilled coffee and the dirty water from the shattered vases. She stared at Jamal as if he were an alien creature, a monster wearing a human skin suit. The horrible, crushing reality was finally sinking into her perfectly manicured, deeply shallow life. She had no money. The joint bank accounts were frozen solid. Her father was completely overdrawn and humiliated. The luxury SUV she proudly drove around town was leased under Jamal's fraudulent shell company, which meant it would be seized by federal authorities before sunset. Her country club memberships, her weekly shopping sprees, her entire identity had been funded by stolen money and lies. She had absolutely nothing. No car, no trust fund, no status, and a husband who was about to trade his bespoke Italian suits for a standard-issue prison jumpsuit. She buried her face in her hands and began to wail. It was a loud, raw, guttural sound of pure devastation that echoed tragically over the crashing Atlantic waves. The officers hauled Jamal to his feet, completely ignoring his pathetic whimpers and weak struggles. They marched him roughly across the patio, leading him right past the shredded remains of his grand illusion. As they shoved him aggressively into the back of the cruiser, his head bumping against the hard metal doorframe, a new frantic movement caught my eye. Patricia, her expensive silk blouse ruined, her hair wild and disheveled, abandoned her sobbing golden child. She scrambled across the wooden deck on her hands and knees. The woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at me, treating me like a disease she could not cure, and a failure she wished to hide, was literally crawling over broken porcelain and spilled coffee. She reached my feet, her trembling hands reaching out to grab the crisp hem of my tailored red trousers. Her face was streaked with dark running mascara, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. She looked up at me, the billionaire daughter she had thrown away, and begged, "Riley, baby, please." Patricia sobbed, her fingers clutching my pants in a desperate death grip. "Stop this. We are your family." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. Patricia's perfectly manicured hands, adorned with diamonds she could no longer afford, clutched desperately at the crisp fabric of my red trousers. Her face, usually an immaculate mask of suburban superiority and judgment, was completely destroyed. Dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, mixing with the sweat and spilled coffee pooling on the wooden deck. She looked pathetic. She looked exactly like the terrified hollow shell of a person she had always been beneath the designer clothes and the country club memberships. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I felt a familiar, ancient pang in my chest. The ingrained instinct of a daughter conditioned to comfort her mother. But that instinct had been beaten, starved, and frozen out of me years ago. I did not feel pity. I felt absolutely nothing. I reached down, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of warmth. I gripped Patricia's trembling wrists. Her skin was clammy and cold. She looked up at me, a flicker of desperate hope lighting her bloodshot eyes, genuinely believing that her maternal performance was about to save her. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my clothes, peeling her away from me like a parasite. I stepped back, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my blazer, putting a definitive physical distance between her desperation and my reality. "You lost the right to call me family the night you threw my clothes in a trash bag and kicked me out into the rain," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling final clarity. Patricia gasped, the sound catching sharply in her throat as she slumped back onto her heels. The memory hung in the salty air between us. I remembered the freezing downpour. I remembered the heavy black garbage bag hitting my chest. I remembered begging her to let me stay just one more night, and I remembered the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place as she locked the door, choosing Richard's demands over her own daughter's safety. She had no defense. She simply buried her face in her hands and wailed. From the side of the patio, a strained, ragged cough broke the sound of Patricia's sobbing. Richard was struggling to push himself up from the deck. He leaned heavily against the stone pillar Jamal had thrown him into, his left arm wrapped protectively around his bruised ribs, his right hand clutching his swelling jaw. He looked ancient. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had dictated my every failure had vanished, replaced by a broken, desperate old man facing the absolute ruin of his carefully constructed kingdom. "Riley." Richard wheezed, his voice lacking its usual booming authority, reduced to a pathetic, gravelly croak. "Please, you have to listen to me. The bank is going to take our house." He stumbled forward, leaning against the edge of a teak lounge chair to keep from collapsing entirely. He looked at David, then back to me, the sheer magnitude of his financial disaster suffocating him. "The home equity loan." Richard continued, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "I can't pay it back. I took out $200,000 to secure that investment with Jamal. I drained the emergency accounts. I leveraged everything we had left. We will be homeless." He reached a trembling hand in my direction, a pathetic parody of the commanding gestures he used to make. He was no longer giving orders. He was begging. "You are a billionaire." Richard pleaded, his eyes wide and wild with panic, trying to grasp the reality of my net worth. "You own the company. You own this entire estate. You can pay it off. It is pocket change to you. You can fix this with a single phone call. You cannot just let your own parents lose their home." I looked down at my father. I studied his bruised, desperate face. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about every time he had sneered at my coding projects, calling them a waste of time. I thought about the countless dinners where he had humiliated me in front of relatives, praising Vanessa's superficial achievements while treating my very existence as a stain on his legacy. I thought about the fact that he had eagerly handed his entire life savings to a con artist simply because the man wore an expensive suit and drove a leased sports car. I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that forced him to strain to hear me. Richard swallowed hard, a flicker of terrified hope remaining in his eyes. "But remember your rule, Dad?" I asked. tilting my head and offering him a razor-thin, merciless smile. I threw his own toxic philosophy, the very words he had used to justify throwing me out onto the street, right back in his face. I don't support poor decisions. The hope in his eyes instantly died, replaced by a hollow, profound despair. You gambled your house on a con artist because he fit your aesthetic? I continued my words, striking him with surgical precision. You chose the illusion of wealth over actual substance. You chose a charming liar over your own daughter because you cared more about status than reality. Actions have consequences. Richard's shoulders collapsed. The fight completely drained out of him. He slid down the side of the chair, sinking to the deck beside his weeping wife, finally understanding that there was no escape. The empire had fallen. I turned my attention to the last remaining piece of this tragic tableau. Vanessa was still sitting on the ground a few feet away, clutching her pregnant belly. Her designer maternity dress was ruined. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. She had watched her husband get shoved into the back of a police cruiser facing federal prison. She had just watched her father realize he was completely bankrupt. Her entire world, built on shopping sprees, country club lunches, and aggressive entitlement, had evaporated into thin air. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally understood the true power dynamic. She was no longer the golden child. She was nothing. I reached into the pocket of my tailored red blazer. My fingers brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper. I pulled it out, smoothing it between my fingers. It was the exact same $50 bill Vanessa had arrogantly thrown at my chest just hours earlier, demanding I go buy them more champagne. I stepped toward her, the red soles of my shoes clicking against the wood. I stood over my sister, looking down at her ruined, pathetic state. I flicked my wrist, tossing the crumpled $50 bill. It fluttered through the salty ocean breeze and landed softly, squarely in Vanessa's lap. "Here," I said, my voice completely devoid of pity, colder than the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the shore behind us. "Catch the bus back to your foreclosed home." Vanessa shrieked a raw, devastated sound that tore from her throat as she stared at the crumpled bill. I did not wait to hear the rest of her sobs. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. I signaled to David, who gave a crisp nod of acknowledgement. Together we walked away from the patio, leaving Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa weeping in the ruins of their own making. I did not look back. The satisfying click of my heels on the stone pavers was the only sound I focused on, even as the chaotic symphony of my ruined family played out behind me. The police cruisers had fully blocked the driveway, their flashing blue and red lights bouncing off the pristine white exterior of the mansion in frantic, rhythmic strokes. As the officers wrestled a handcuffed, violently thrashing Jamal into the back of a squad car, I stopped near the massive glass sliding doors of the main house. I turned to face the private security team that had arrived in a sleek black SUV just behind David. 4 men built like brick walls and dressed in tactical black stood in perfectly disciplined formation, waiting for my command. I pointed toward the patio where Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa were still crumpled on the deck, surrounded by the debris of their shattered illusions and the spilled coffee. "Remove these trespassers from my property," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a woman who finally owned her space. "Make sure they do not take a single item from inside the house. If they resist, if they try to grab so much as a coat or a purse, have the local officers arrest them for trespassing and attempted theft." The lead security guard gave a crisp nod, signaling his men to move forward. They marched onto the patio with practiced efficiency, their imposing presence instantly swallowing the remaining space. Seeing the armed guards advancing toward her, Patricia realized her pathetic groveling had completely failed. The weeping, desperate mother act vanished in a fraction of a second. The carefully maintained mask of suburban elegance she had worn for decades completely dissolved, revealing the ugly, venomous core beneath. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the porcelain shards digging into her knees. Her hands balled into tight fists and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You ungrateful brat!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking as she unleashed 30 years of suppressed resentment. She pointed a trembling finger at me, spit flying from her lips, her eyes wide and manic. After everything we did for you, after putting a roof over your head and feeding you, you are a cold, heartless bitch. You will die alone with your money. You hear me? No one will ever love you. You are nothing but a vindictive little mistake. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Her words, which once would have sent me spiraling into days of anxious depression, now bounced off me like rain against a reinforced window. I simply looked at her, tilting my head slightly, observing her as one might observe a rabid animal behind zoo glass. Her rage was entirely powerless. It was the desperate thrashing of a woman who realized she had bet on the wrong horse and lost everything. I turned my back on her screaming fit and stepped through the sliding doors into the cool, silent sanctuary of my home. The heavy glass glided shut behind me, instantly muting the shrill noise of her temper tantrum. I stood in the expansive living room, surrounded by custom Italian leather furniture, soaring ceilings, and sweeping ocean views. I crossed my arms and watched the final act of my family's destruction play out through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The armed security guards were not gentle. They physically corralled Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa, forcing them off the pristine wooden deck and marching them down the long gravel driveway toward the exit. It was a pathetic, humiliating parade of misery. The moment they were forced together, they completely turned on each other. Through the thick glass, I watched Richard violently gesturing at Patricia, his face purple with rage, clearly blaming her for pushing him to secure the home equity loan to impress Jamal. Patricia was screaming right back at him, striking his shoulder with her open hand, blaming him for being foolish enough to sign over his life savings without running a background check. Vanessa was hobbling along behind them, struggling in her expensive ruined dress, clutching the crumpled $50 bill I had thrown at her. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming at both of her parents as she realized she had no ride, no husband, no trust fund, and absolutely no future. They shoved and cursed at one another the entire way down the long driveway. There was no loyalty among them, no familial bond to hold them together in a crisis. They were a toxic unit, finally consuming itself, tearing each other apart the moment their superficial world collapsed. I watched them until they were nothing more than tiny, pathetic figures disappearing past the heavy iron gates. The police cruisers rolled out behind them, taking Jamal away to face the grim reality of federal prison. I picked up a sleek remote from the coffee table and pressed a single button. The automated blackout blinds began to descend over the massive windows. The heavy fabric slid down, shutting out the driveway, shutting out the road, and shutting out the last remaining visual of my toxic past. I stood in the center of the quiet, luxurious house and closed my eyes. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air. The atmosphere smelled of expensive cedar and ocean salt, completely free of the suffocating tension that had plagued my entire existence. For the first time in 30 years, my shoulders dropped. The crushing weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their constant belittling evaporated. The toxicity was finally permanently purged from my life. I was safe. I was victorious. I was completely free. Footsteps echoed softly on the imported marble floor behind me. David walked up, his tablet glowing softly in the dim light of the room. He stopped at my side, his eyes fixed on the closed blinds for a moment, before turning to me with a fiercely satisfied smile. The SEC just confirmed receipt of the encrypted files, David said, his tone crisp, professional, and ringing with absolute finality. They have everything they need. Jamal is looking at 10 to 15 years. 30 days. That was exactly how long it took for the universe to forcefully rebalance the scales. The pungent, suffocating odor of stale fryer grease and cheap industrial disinfectant clung to Vanessa like a second skin. She shifted her weight from one swollen, aching foot to the other, wincing as a sharp pain shot up her lower back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the fast food restaurant buzzed above her, casting a sickly, pale yellow glow over her greasy polyester uniform. The fabric stretched uncomfortably tight across her heavily pregnant belly, the cheap material scratching against her skin. That will be $8.45, Vanessa mumbled, her voice devoid of its former haughty arrogance. She stared blankly at the cash register screen, her perfectly manicured nails long gone, replaced by chipped polish and burn marks from the heat lamps. A teenager in a ripped hoodie shoved a crumpled $10 bill across the counter without making eye contact. Vanessa fumbled with the cash drawer, handing back the change with trembling fingers. Just a few weeks ago, she had been swiping a platinum credit card to buy designer maternity clothes without glancing at the price tags. Now she was calculating how many extra shifts she needed to pick up just to afford generic diapers and basic groceries. The illusion of her billionaire lifestyle had evaporated overnight. Federal agents had arrived at her luxury apartment building before the sun even rose on the Monday following the patio incident. They moved with terrifying speed, seizing everything Jamal had bought with his fraudulent shell companies. She had stood on the sidewalk in her silk pajamas, weeping hysterically as a tow truck hooked up her pristine white Tesla and dragged it away. The authorities froze every joint bank account, leaving her with a balance of absolutely zero. Jamal's assets were completely locked down by the government, and the man himself was sitting in a federal holding cell, staring down the barrel of 10 to 15 years. He had not called her once. The charming, wealthy visionary she had married was dead, leaving behind a terrified con artist who was already trying to secure a plea deal by throwing his former business associates under the bus. Across town, a different kind of misery was playing out in agonizing slow motion. A heavy wooden sign had been violently driven into the center of the perfectly manicured front lawn of a massive suburban estate. The bold, glaring red letters screamed bank-owned foreclosure for the entire neighborhood to see. Inside the cavernous, echoing house, Richard and Patricia stood surrounded by a sea of cheap cardboard boxes. The luxurious furniture, the expensive art, and the custom rugs had already been sold off in a desperate, humiliating estate sale just to cover their immediate legal fees and outstanding debts. Every footstep echoed loudly against the bare hardwood floors, emphasizing the hollow emptiness of the life they had built. They were packing the last of their clothes, preparing to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a notoriously bad neighborhood on the other side of the city. It was a building with peeling paint, a broken security gate, and a persistent smell of damp mildew in the hallways. It was the absolute antithesis of the country club lifestyle they had relentlessly worshipped. Richard forcefully shoved a stack of old financial files into a box, his face red and slick with sweat. He dragged a roll of packing tape across the cardboard, the loud ripping sound slicing through the tense silence of the empty living room. "This is your fault," Richard suddenly barked, hurling the tape dispenser across the room. It shattered against the baseboard. "You pushed me into this. You coddled Vanessa. You insisted Jamal was a genius. You demanded we maintain that ridiculous lifestyle to impress your shallow friends, and now we are going to die in a roach-infested apartment." Patricia dropped a stack of folded shirts, whirling around to face him, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated venom. "Do not you dare put this on me," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You signed the home equity loan. You were the one who wanted to play venture capitalist and show off at the golf course. You gambled everything we had on a smooth-talking fraud because you were too arrogant to admit you did not understand the technology. You ruined us, Richard. You ruined everything." She sank to the bare floor, pulling her knees to her chest, as the reality of her complete social exile washed over her. She began to weep, a pathetic, gasping sound. She had gone to the grocery store yesterday and ran directly into 3 women from her beloved country club. The women had looked right through her. They did not smile. They did not offer sympathy. They had turned their shopping carts around and walked down another aisle, completely ostracizing her. The fraud scandal was public knowledge, plastered across local news sites and whispered about in every affluent circle in the city. Patricia and Richard were no longer the respected elite. They were toxic pariahs, radioactive to anyone with wealth or status. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the empty house into shadows, they sat in the dark. The power had been shut off hours ago. The house was freezing, stripping away the last remaining shred of comfort. Desperation makes a man do foolish things. Richard pulled his cell phone from his pocket. The screen illuminated his exhausted, aged face in the darkness. His hands shook violently as he scrolled through his contacts, stopping on a name he had previously associated with nothing but failure and disappointment. He stared at Riley's contact information. He had ignored her for years, used her as a punching bag, and literally cast her out into the rain. But now, she was the billionaire. She was the only person on Earth who possessed the power to pull him out of this suffocating abyss. He swallowed his pride entirely, abandoning whatever dignity he had left, and pressed the call button. He held the phone to his ear, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his bruised ribs, praying she would answer and show him the mercy he had never shown her. There was a brief moment of dead air, then a cold, automated operator voice filled the silent, foreclosed mansion. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. The agonizing sound of Vanessa's shriek hung in the crisp morning air, a raw, devastated wail that tore from her throat as she stared blankly at the crumpled $50 bill resting in her lap. She made no move to pick it up. She simply sat on the damp wooden deck, paralyzed by the crushing, undeniable reality of her total financial ruin. I did not wait to hear the rest of her pathetic sobbing. I turned my back on the pathetic tableau of my ruined family. My posture was impeccably straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. I looked past the shattered porcelain and spilled coffee, directing my attention to the perimeter of the patio, where my private security detail had been standing in disciplined silence. The team consisted of 4 highly trained professionals, each built like a solid brick wall and dressed in immaculate tactical black suits. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, earpieces coiled discreetly behind their ears, waiting for my signal. I caught the eye of the lead guard, a towering man with a stern, impassive face. "Remove these trespassers from my property," I commanded, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the patio with absolute frigid authority. "If they resist, arrest them for trespassing." The lead guard offered a single crisp nod. He raised a hand, signaling his men to advance. Their heavy black boots thudded rhythmically against the expensive teak wood of the deck as they moved in on Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa with swift, unyielding purpose. Seeing the massive armed guards descending upon her, Patricia instantly realized that her pathetic, tearful groveling had completely failed. The desperate, weeping mother persona evaporated in a fraction of a second. The carefully maintained, socially acceptable mask of suburban elegance she had worn for 3 decades dissolved, completely exposing the ugly, venomous core that had always festered beneath the surface. She scrambled back, her hands scraping against the rough wood, her face contorted into a hideous, twisting sneer of pure, unfiltered rage. The woman who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me down to size was finally showing her true colors, cornered and completely stripped of her power. "You ungrateful brat!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed violently over the crashing ocean waves. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my back, her eyes wide and manic, dark streaks of ruined mascara painting her cheeks like war paint. "You will die alone with your money." I stopped for a fraction of a second. The words were designed to cut to strike at the deepest insecurities a daughter could possess. Years ago, that venomous attack would have sent me spiraling into days of anxious, suffocating depression. But today, the words bounced off my armor like rain against reinforced glass. Her rage was entirely impotent. It was the desperate, pathetic thrashing of a woman who had finally realized she had bet on the wrong horse and lost absolutely everything. I did not flinch. I did not offer her the satisfaction of a reaction, a defense, or even a backward glance. I smoothly resumed my pace, turning my back entirely on the chaotic garbage fire burning on my patio. I walked purposefully toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass sliding doors that led into the main living room of the mansion. As I crossed the threshold, the heavy motorized glass panels glided shut behind me with a solid, satisfying mechanical click. The sensory shift was immediate and profound. The sharp smell of the salty ocean air and spilled espresso vanished, replaced by the subtle, expensive scent of fresh cedar and bergamot. The shrill, agonizing sounds of Patricia's screaming and Vanessa's hysterical weeping were instantly muted, reduced to a faint, distant hum behind the thick, soundproof architectural glass. I stood alone in the center of the expansive living room. The space was a masterpiece of modern luxury, featuring soaring ceilings, custom Italian leather furniture, and pristine museum-quality artwork. It was a fortress of absolute peace, a physical manifestation of the empire I had built with my own hands. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched the final pathetic act of my family's destruction play out through the massive windows. The armed security guards were highly professional but entirely uncompromising. They physically corralled Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa, forcing them off the pristine wooden deck and steering them toward the front of the estate. It was a humiliating, degrading parade of misery. As they were marched down the long, sweeping gravel driveway toward the heavy iron exit gates, the last remaining threads of their familial loyalty instantly evaporated. The moment they were forced together in their shared ruin, they completely turned on each other like trapped, starving animals. Through the thick glass, I watched the chaotic pantomime unfold. Richard was violently gesturing at Patricia, his face purple with unhinged rage, clearly blaming her for pushing him to secure the disastrous home equity loan just to impress her shallow socialite friends. Patricia was screaming right back at him, striking his shoulder with her open hand, blaming him for being foolish and arrogant enough to sign over his entire life savings without running a basic background check. Vanessa was hobbling along behind them, struggling awkwardly in her ruined designer maternity dress. She was sobbing hysterically, shouting vitriol at both of her parents, as she realized she was entirely dependent on two people who were now completely bankrupt. They shoved, pointed, and cursed at one another the entire way down the pristine driveway. There was absolutely no loyalty among them, no unconditional bond to hold them together in a crisis. They were a toxic, parasitic unit, finally consuming itself, tearing each other apart the exact moment their superficial world collapsed. I watched them until they were nothing more than tiny, pathetic figures, disappearing past the heavy iron gates, swallowed up by the reality of the consequences they had earned. Inside the quiet, luxurious house, I took a deep breath. The conditioned air filled my lungs, and for the first time in 30 years, the tension completely left my shoulders. The crushing weight of their expectations, their casual cruelty, and their constant suffocating belittling was gone. The toxicity is finally purged. I was safe. I was victorious. I was free. Soft footsteps echoed evenly against the imported marble floor behind me. David walked up behind me, stopping a respectful distance away. He held his encrypted tablet in one hand, his posture relaxed but vigilant. The SEC just confirmed receipt of the files. David announced, his voice smooth, professional, and ringing with absolute finality. Jamal is looking at 10 to 15 years. I nodded slowly, letting the massive weight of David's words settle over the expansive, quiet room. There was no sudden outburst of joy, no dramatic cheering, and no need for a triumphant display. The justice we had secured was cold, precise, and entirely absolute. I thanked David, my voice remarkably steady, and dismissed him along with the rest of the private security team for the evening. I listened to the heavy tires of their SUVs crunching against the gravel driveway as they departed, leaving me in total solitude. The violent, destructive storm had finally passed, leaving behind a perfectly clear sky. A few weeks later, the physical scars of my family's chaotic intrusion had been completely erased from my sanctuary. The house had been thoroughly and meticulously purged of any lingering traces of their toxic presence. The shattered glass coffee table, once a casualty of Patricia's unhinged rage, was entirely gone. In its place stood a magnificent custom-carved slab of imported Calicut marble. Its thick, pristine white surface was veined with striking threads of deep gold and charcoal. It was heavier, undeniably stronger, and infinitely more valuable than the fragile piece that had been there before. It served as a fitting daily metaphor for the unbreakable life I had rebuilt from the wreckage of their expectations. The wall where the damaged painting once hung had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. I had hired a team of elite contractors to tear out the drywall and the structural framing, opening the space entirely. They installed a massive, seamless picture window that stretched from the floor to the soaring ceiling. Now, instead of looking at a framed, static piece of canvas, The room opened directly onto the endless rolling expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The horizon stretched out infinitely in every direction. It offered a daily, breathtaking reminder that the world was vast and full of boundless possibilities, completely untethered from the narrow, suffocating box my parents had tried to force me into for 3 decades. I walked into the chef's kitchen, the smooth hardwood cool beneath my bare feet. I retrieved a bottle of rare vintage Bordeaux from the climate-controlled cellar. The cork popped with a satisfying resonance. I poured a generous measure into a heavy crystal glass, watching the deep ruby liquid catch the golden light of the descending sun. It sparkled with a quiet, undeniable intensity. I carried the glass out through the sliding doors and onto the expansive wooden balcony. The evening air was crisp and incredibly clean, carrying the sharp, invigorating scent of sea salt, damp sand, and wild beach grass. I leaned against the sturdy cedar railing, letting the steady ocean breeze wash over my face and tangle in my hair. For the first time in my entire existence, the persistent gnawing knot of anxiety in my chest was completely absent. There was no anger left in me. The burning, acidic resentment that had fueled my silent, relentless ascent to the top had completely burned out. The furious, desperate need to prove them wrong had simply evaporated. What replaced it was a profound, unshakable, and absolute peace. I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the waves against the shoreline, syncing my breathing to the pulse of the tide. I thought about the stark, satisfying contrast between my glorious present and their miserable reality. I pictured Vanessa suffocating in the greasy, stifling air of a fast food kitchen, her feet swollen and her back aching. Her billionaire delusions had been brutally replaced by the grim daily calculation of minimum wage and impending motherhood. I imagined Richard and Patricia sitting in the suffocating darkness of their cramped, roach-infested apartment, turning their toxic venom on each other, because they had absolutely no one else left to blame or manipulate. I thought of Jamal permanently stripped of his bespoke tailored suits and his smooth talking charm, staring blankly at the concrete walls of a federal holding cell. They had spent decades treating me like an insignificant pawn, in their greedy game of social climbing, utterly convinced they were the untouchable architects of my destiny. Now they were trapped in miserable prisons of their own making, while I stood on the balcony of an empire I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. As the evening sky began to bleed into brilliant, dramatic shades of violet, crimson, and gold, I took a slow sip of the heavy, complex wine. The rich warmth settled deep in my chest, a physical manifestation of my hard-won victory. People often fundamentally misunderstand the true nature of power. They mistakenly believe it is measured by the commas in a bank account, the square footage of a luxury estate, or the ability to ruthlessly bend others to your will. For a long time, I thought securing my financial independence would be the ultimate impenetrable shield against the people who were supposed to protect me but chose to break me instead. I thought amassing undeniable wealth would force them to finally see my worth. But true power is not about forcing blind, willfully ignorant eyes to see. It is not about screaming your accomplishments into a dark void, desperately hoping for a scrap of validation that will never come. True power is the absolute, unapologetic freedom to walk away. It is the ability to look at the people who have systematically dimmed your light, who have drained your energy and minimized your existence, and simply decide that you are no longer available for their consumption. Society conditions us to believe that blood requires infinite loyalty. We are taught that the title of family is a binding contract requiring endless forgiveness and perpetual sacrifice. But toxicity does not miraculously become acceptable just because it shares your DNA. You do not owe your life, your sanity, or your success to people who only view you as a disposable resource to be exploited or a convenient scapegoat to be blamed. For years, I believed that the ultimate revenge would be a dramatic, explosive confrontation. I envisioned a screaming match where I laid bare every hurt, every slight, and every betrayal. I thought revenge was about actively destroying them, but the truth is far more elegant and profoundly simple. The greatest revenge is not destruction. The greatest revenge is simply living a spectacular life. It is waking up every single morning in a bright sanctuary of your own making. It is breathing air that is completely free of manipulation and deceit. It is knowing that your success, your profound peace, and your limitless future are entirely your own. Sometimes you have to burn the old bridges to light the way forward. You have to let the fire entirely consume the crushing expectations, the unearned guilt, and the inherited trauma. And when the heavy smoke finally clears, you realize that the ashes left behind are the absolute perfect foundation for an empire. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, pulling the last brilliant golden rays of light beneath the dark churning surface of the ocean. The vast sky deepened into a rich velvety indigo, dotted with the first faint glimmer of evening stars. I took one final lingering sip of the wine, savoring the rich finish. I reached into the pocket of my silk trousers and pulled out my phone. The screen remained completely dark. There were no missed calls I cared to return, no urgent messages requiring my immediate attention, and absolutely no ties binding me to a past I had officially and permanently buried. I pressed the power button, holding it down until the device powered off entirely. I slipped the dead phone back into my pocket, turned my face toward the open sea, and let the cool night air embrace me. The screen fades to black, fades to